Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm been joined here with Samir Stewart, who's a former World Bank investment policy analyst who now advises Western and Indian startups and angel investors, especially when it comes to engaging with the Indian market. Samir, thank you so much for taking some time, especially with power outages.
That's one of the challenges of the Indian market, which I hope to discuss later.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's so special about the South Asian market? Why is it different to the West?
Well, quite obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is the size of the market. You do have a lot of scope the in terms of the size of the country. You could decide to be in the south, the west, east, north. You've basically got a captive market when it comes to the middle class, which would really be the backbone of any economy. You have a middle class of anywhere between 450 to 500 million, which, if you think in European equivalent terms, is pretty much all of Europe. Virtually all of Europe. And this is a growing middle class. There is a lot of economic opportunity that people have these days within the Indian context. A lot of people who formerly did not have access to markets or access to foreign products are now actively buying foreign products, and that's not just only in the first tier cities that most Europeans, most Westerners would know about, like Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore. We're also talking about second tier and third tier cities, and those are coming online, and that represents a tremendous opportunity. So if you know where to go, and if you know what it is you're trying to do, the market, the level of the market, the scale of the market is here. So you could have a micro market, you could have a larger market, or you could have an extremely large market that you could tap into depending upon what it is you're trying to do. What also makes South Asia unique is, I just mentioned micro markets, but you also have, I guess, on the flip side of the coin, because of the size of the market, and if you look at South Asia as all of South Asia, for a moment I'm just considering South Asia as India, but obviously it includes Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. But just if you focus on India just for a second, you have 29 states. You have various layers of bureaucracy within those states. So you do have a state investment promotion board. You have a foreign investment promotion agency, which people typically need to go through, which companies typically need to go through when they're coming into the country in terms of setting up JVs and whatnot. So you do have different layers of bureaucracy. But if you're able to crack that code, India could be quite a profitable place to do business. And you can see that with the number of companies that have actually come to India at larger levels, as well as at the incipient or more what we would call startup levels.
So you have an interesting background because you're American and also from India as well, right? So you have experience in kind of both markets. And you often hear in the news about companies trying to enter the Indian market, the South Asian market, and just failing, right? So what are the challenges, the most common challenges that you see when you think of a Western company interested in entering India? What are the biggest things that they often come up against that they might not realize?
Well, in no particular order, I would say language. So, obviously a lot of India speaks English, but there's a whole host of India that does not, especially in rural areas or semi-rural areas or semi-rural areas. And there's a lot of India that actually just speaks Hindi. So depending upon where you are going in the market, you basically might have a language challenge. Then there's also another language that's I wouldn't say it's necessarily unique to India, but it's it's a challenge across a lot of countries. It's called the language of corruption. Um, so you do happen to face a fair amount of that, but as long as you know how to navigate certain sectors that you are, where there's more opportunity and less red tape, you should be good. There's also the issue of expectations versus reality. Now, a lot of companies kind of want to come in and believe that they can effectively target a whole large segment of the market, while the reality is things move very differently in India than they would move in the West in many cases. So there's an issue of expectations versus reality. You cannot do business in India in India as you would do in the West. Things are much more linear. In many cases, you would have one-stop shops. In India, places that are called one-stop shops, I'm just giving one example, are not necessarily one-stop shops. I mean, they are the beginning of a chain of a chain of bureaucracy. But you need to really understand that. And sometimes foreign entities come into the country and expect one-stop shops to function, similar to what they would do in the West. Then you have an issue of strategy versus tactics. Strategy is how you actually kind of get into the market, whereas tactics is how you execute to be. Strategy is how you through a market, whereas tactics is what you do to execute within that market. Often enough, there's a disparity between what your strategy is and what your tactics are to actually reach that market. I can come to that a little bit later. You also have competition with local partners. So in many cases, a Starbucks comes to India, but it's difficult to break into the coffee market because Indians like their coffee with chicory, which is a local additive that Indians love their coffee with. So that's an acquired taste. And Starbucks is trying to break in. It needs to break in a very different way. I can come to that. It's actually a point I've noted to discuss in a little bit more detail at a later point. There's also minimal brand loyalties. So Indians aren't necessarily they're increasingly becoming brand conscious, but there are issues with remaining loyal to certain brands. So it's a very price sensitive market. It's probably one of the most price sensitive markets in the world, where small differences in price can result in somebody going from a Colgate to a Close-Up, even if they like one, but really at the end of the day they don't really care. It's all about the price. Then you have disparate preferences. You have fragmented distribution channels. A major issue in India is lack of follow-up. So when you get into a partnership, sometimes unless you're with the right partner, and I'm going to stress on that, getting into partnership with the right partner is absolutely crucial in India. I can talk a little bit more in detail about that in just a moment. But unless you're with the right partner, things could go very unexpected and could go a little haywire also. It's also a very hyper-competitive market. It's a huge market. There's a lot of different players in a lot of different sectors. You don't necessarily have to be the best coming in. You need to be better than what is actually existing in the various sectors. So I think that's another issue that various brands have when they kind of come into the country. They just want to be the best product at whatever price they believe they can enter at. And often enough, that by itself is not a good strategy. You could go wrong in that strategy by not focusing on what I was just discussing earlier.
So then let's just talk about these partnerships, right? Partnerships dealing with or looking to enter, companies looking to enter India and wider South Asia need partnerships, and they need the right kind of partnerships.
Right.
How does a company go about evaluating those partnerships if they aren't Indian, right? What?
That's a very good.
Yeah, how do they do that?
So that's a very good question. I mean, typically what happens in many cases is So increasingly, so there is a, let's put it this way. There's a formal answer and there's an informal answer. Let me start with the informal answer. So typically what happens is nowadays Indians are extremely well educated, very well traveled. Many of them attend Western universities. Typically what happens is people who've gone to some of the better known universities, University of London, London Business School, INSEAD, and the US, whether it's Harvard or Kellogg or any of these kinds of places, do make the connections with folks in the US or in Europe who are trying to enter India. And there is straight away that, that basic trust, especially when you've gone as part of a cohort and, study together, I guess, sort of gain that sort of comfort level. So that is one way by which many, business relationships are actually initiated. Now, the more formal response to that question would be chambers of commerce, trade shows to a certain extent. And of course, these days, people also reach out through internet marketing and Facebook posts and Facebook marketing. It's hard to segment because you never actually know who you're getting into partnership with, or who, the antecedents of anybody who is portraying themselves to be of a certain size, of a certain scale. And that is an issue in India because, now given increasing interest in India, a lot of players seem to, well, let's say players. Not as many of them are actual players, but many entities who believe themselves to be players or want to portray themselves as players sort of come into the market. And often enough, they might not have the capacity to deliver. They might not even be interested in partnership. They might just be interested in knowing what's going on and, knowing just, sort of getting, satiating their own egos, sort of having conversations with their families and saying, look, we know who's coming in, and, sort of, portraying themselves to be one thing to the potential foreign partner and then portraying themselves to be something else to somebody local. So it's very essential that better channel partner. So often enough, what many firms do is they go through one of the bigger consulting organizations, such as an Ernst & Young or a Deloitte, and they sort of trust those partners. Or if you're trying to get into, say, a real estate partnership, then you go in through an entity such as JLL, Jones Long LaSalle, or you go in through Edelweiss, or you go through CBRE or Knight Frank or Sotheby's. So you have these kinds of recognized names that recognized in the West, and these are the sorts of entities that Western companies typically sort of go through to reach the potential Indian partner. So there's no right royal way. It's a combination of these various factors. But obviously, it's important to reach the right partner. Otherwise, you just end up spending a lot of time that could essentially be going down the drain.
So when you're speaking with Western companies who, and most of these are probably startups, maybe they're not looking to connect through Sotheby's, or they're not at that kind of scale. What do you advise them to do in, or steps that they can take when they're evaluating potential partners that, as you say, may or may not be able to deliver? Is it working through intermediaries like yourself? Is it going out there and meeting them? Are there certain types of things that you'd suggest someone do, especially if you're at a smaller company and you're evaluating either some sort of a strategic partnership or a service level partnership that just maybe increases the confidence that this might be a good partnership?
So I think you do need somebody local. You cannot come in just by yourself. Companies have tried it in the past, and even larger companies have tried it in the past and have failed quite spectacularly. I think you do need a local entity of some sort, someone who does understand the local culture, does speak the local language, has the local connection. I think this is true of many, many markets, not just in India, not just in South Asia. Heck, it's even true in Europe. I mean, some of the best business connections are old time connections. I mean, even if you try to, if an Indian came to the UK or to France and try to, get into a partnership with a French entity or a British entity without going through a local connect, might not exactly know how to go about doing it. Yes, I mean, you might have the systems in place, you might have one-stop shops in place, but at the end of the day, business is about trust and delivering on commitments and taking responsibility. Now, how do one-stop shops ensure that? They don't. So a lot of it does come down to trust and old relationships. And I think that's true pretty much anywhere in the world. I mean, Latin America, US, Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia. I think that's pretty much true. So I think the key really when a company is coming in is, yes, you do have to go through some trusted party, either somebody who you can trust who is local to where you're located in the UK or France or wherever in Europe or the US, or an entity who might have experience in your market as well as in the local market, and has been working with startups and perhaps with angel investors. What's key in terms of the strategy to move forward is you need to see whoever you ultimately end up in partnership with. You need to see strength within country operations, and you also need to probably see the ability of that entity, of that local entity, to create, I would say, small, fast, and entrepreneurial regional leadership teams to take your service as and as efficiently and as cheaply as possible across the market. And that's, let me stress on that again. What I said was small, fast, and entrepreneurial regional leadership teams, essentially to allocate resources effectively across the markets, because you could get caught up in, given India's size and scale. I mean, this is not a small country. This is not Peru, or this is not Nicaragua. This is a large country. You could get caught up in a whole bunch of activities that are not very efficient or effective from the point of view of getting to market as quickly as possible. So you do want to see that in your partner, so that they're able to leverage a scarce executive talent. They're able to drive innovations within the market. You're able to cut costs. So whichever company comes in, you have to invest a little bit in research. You have to adapt the way you normally do wherever you're located in the West. And at the end of the day, in India, the bottom line is consumer is king. That's the most important thing to remember. Consumer is always king. Consumers, like I said earlier, they are not necessarily bound to brands. I mean, they do change their loyalties. And a lot of that has to do with price. So these things are tricky, but if you crack the code, not just the consumer, but your company is king as well.
Yeah, I think that connects really well with some of the other things that you were saying. Talking about these micro markets, for example, and I think maybe I'm rephrasing it, but there's a difference between kind of outsourcing your operations of responsibility of getting into India versus building a partnership with someone with the knowledge of that space. You as a business owner should never be outsourcing your strategy specifically, but at the same time, you also have to be reasonable with knowing that you're not going to launch on Monday and have half of India using your app by Friday. It's not going to happen that way. And so and I feel like sometimes people maybe are worried that they don't understand the market enough because they're worried that they're too narrow or they're worried that they're too broad. And so if you're having those kind of worries, it sounds like that's a good thing that if you're concerned about that. And that's what a partner can actually help you articulate, as long as they're not, as you said, as long as they're not kind of promising the moon, and that they can show that they have that kind of background. Are there some interesting, are there some good examples of like Western companies coming in and either doing very well because of partnerships, or doing very poorly either because of partnerships or lack of?
There's plenty of examples of both, but let me just, before I come to that, I think you made a very important point about width versus depth. And I think another area just sort of struck me while you were talking. Another area that where companies kind of fail when they come in, or could have problems when they come in, is analysis paralysis. There's, at the end of the day, the Indian consumer wants to see value. He or she wants to see a service or a product that is better and cheaper than what they already use. Having said that, does that mean that you're necessarily guaranteed brand loyalty? No, it doesn't. It just means that there has to be a case. There has to be some sort of a proof of concept before you sort of come into the market with a whole strategy. So, for example, let me give you, there's a lot of different examples, both in terms of successes and failures, but just to supplement the point I just made, Subway came into India, I think about a good maybe 6-7 years ago, or maybe just probably a little bit more than that. And before even one of their stores were established, they spent about 3 years honing their strategy in terms of where they were going to go, the partners, the local partners they were going to partner with for their breads, for the cheese, their locations. Getting locations in India can sometimes be tricky, particularly in the tier 1 cities, because everybody wants to be in the tier 1 cities. Everybody wants to be in Bangalore or Mumbai or Delhi, but the opportunity also exists. And I want to emphasize this to anybody who might be watching this. The opportunity also exists in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And there's a lot of entrepreneurship in those cities as well that could be cultivated. So Subway, just coming back to that point, Subway basically took, I think, at least 3 years before even one of their stores came up. And I think what they did in the process was they really honed their research. They got the right sort of partner involved, but they weren't, their focus was depth. I guess their focus was depth as well as width, because they are all over the country and they do have a very impressive range of products, many of which are Indianized, because the Indian palate is very different from the Western palate. I'm sure many people who might be watching this, who might have tried South Asian food, know that it's quite different, and it's very tasty, but it has a very different sort of appeal. And therefore, McDonald's comes in and you don't have a Big Mac beef burger, because that's not going to work in a country where beef historically is sort of looked down upon. And that also becomes fodder for political parties who are against beef, and in terms of local culture and all of that. So they've adapted a menu which in many cases is not recognizable to a Westerner. So that's one way that they've adapted as well. And they also took some time before they actually got started. But in terms of other successful partnerships, 3 straight away come to mind, not necessarily within the startup space, but you'll get some sort of an idea. Air Asia, Vistara Airlines, Starbucks. The common thing with each of these 3 is the Tata Group. The Tata Group is probably India's oldest conglomerate. It's a conglomerate of 99 companies, been around for the longest time. And when you say Tata, it's the sort of mark of approval. These guys are conservative in approach, but when they take on a stake and when they take on a partnership, they will deliver. They have that's institutional commitment. Asia is a combination between Asia, Malaysia, and is another airline that's in India. That's a combination between Tata's and Singapore Airlines. Tata owns 51%, Singapore Airlines owns 49%. Starbucks first came in, I think, with another company, but they've ended up with the Tatas also. So Starbucks has made quite a splash in the Indian market. So they don't necessarily, if you remember, I mentioned in my earlier comments, I mentioned coffee and how different how different the
palate.
taste of India, the taste of coffee needs to be within India. Well, what Starbucks did was they didn't try to compete with that coffee. They've gone into a completely different segment. A lot of a lot of the products of Starbucks are recognized as Starbucks anywhere in the world, but they do have some local adaptations as well. They are probably the most expensive coffee in the market, but that's the consumer knows that going in, and when you go into a Starbucks, you're not only going in for the coffee, you're going in for the ambience, you're going in for the style, you're going in as a high-end sort of coffee experience. That's the way they marketed it, and they've been quite successful. Other examples: Marks and Spencer's with Reliance Retail, Zara, the Spanish fashion icon, with Trent, which is also coincidentally a Tata company. US Polo, the shirts, with Arvind Group, Clark's with Future Group, Gap with Arvind Group. Within the media space, there's also the startups that, well, not necessarily startups, but Vice, the major international channel, has tied up with Times Group. That's been quite successful. There's a BBC digital hub that's opened up in New Delhi. That's been quite successful as well. Then you have tie-ups in the insurance space. So you have Bharti, which is otherwise known for being telecom giants, who've tied up with AXA for general insurance. You also have ICICI, which is a huge bank in India, having tied up with Prudential for general insurance. So you have all these kinds of companies which have tied up, and the key determining factor. I mean, obviously these are larger companies, but you also the lessons learned from these larger companies apply to smaller startups as well. I started by emphasizing Tata in the first three partnerships: AirAsia, Vistara, and Starbucks. And what did I say? Each of these partnerships is marked by consistency and a commitment to deliver. Tata has that reputation, right? So when you enter into the Indian market, you need to be partnered with a company or an entity which has some sort of a track record, or at least where the entrepreneur involved on the Indian side, or the South Asian side rather, has some serious financial backing, and comes with 4 or 5 different sort of references, and then you sort of roll with the punches. Not everybody's going to partner with Tata, obviously, but that's a model that could be used for startups that are coming in. Now, having said that, I also want to emphasize one other point when it comes to a successful partnerships. There are certain brands that have come in by themselves. IKEA has come in by itself. Promode, you might have heard of them. I think they are in the clothing space as well. Decathlon, the French company, they've kind of come in by themselves. But these are all, note that these are all single brand retail. And that has opened up as a sector in recent times. So it opens up for these sorts of companies. Not every startup is going to be an IKEA or a Decathlon or a Promode, but I'm saying the scope for that also exists within India. So I would say these are examples. I've given you several examples of successful startups. There's also been a few examples of less than successful. Sorry, let me just go back for a second. I've given you several examples of successful partnerships, not not necessarily successful startups. I said startups in place of partnerships. But in terms of partnerships that may not have been as successful, or may have initially been successful and then run into heavy waters, one of the best examples is McDonald's. McDonald's entered India in 1996 with a company called, I think it was called Connaught Plaza Restaurant Private Limited. And lately that expansion has been hit by conflict because of issues with the local partner in terms one company says, I think McDonald's, says that, this local partner was cheating on some of the rights that he'd been granted, and he says that they would try to undervalue him in the partnership and not give him his dues. So you have some of that. Motorola, Coca-Cola, Nokia, was doing well for a while. Nokia controlled the Indian market till about 2014. Today, it's destroyed. It's absolutely destroyed. Nobody buys Nokia. To say that you own a Nokia phone in India right now is like, it's like saying that you belong to the 50s. It's irrelevant. And so some of that has been because they haven't adapted. They've come in successfully, maybe, but they haven't adapted. Vodafone is another company that has run into some heavy waters as well. Walmart had an issue. They were trying to tie up with this company called Bharti Retail. So again, Bharti is a giant within the telecom space, but they were expanding within retail. So their retail arm called Bharti Retail was trying to tie up with Walmart, but there was an issue over FDI policy at the time. DeBella Coffee, there's another huge entity called DeBella Coffee. I'm not sure if you know if it. I'm not sure if it's available in Scotland where you're located, but it is absolutely outstanding coffee. It's available largely in Mumbai. I actually haven't seen it in Bangalore where I'm located, but it's outstanding coffee. The reason I haven't seen them in Bangalore is because they and their local partner have been sparring over a licensing agreement. So you do have these sort of teething issues. I think part of it is once the entity comes into India, and you're doing well, don't necessarily assume that because you're doing well, you're always going to be doing well. Don't assume you know everything in India. Don't assume the Western way is the Indian way. And it's important to adapt to local attitudes. It really is. I mean, you have to really remember that there's a lot of local micro submarkets. So what works in Tamil Nadu in the south may not work in Punjab in the north. So just because you've been successful in Punjab doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be successful in Tamil Nadu. So there has to be a willingness to learn about I guess Indian culture or Indian tastes, the process. But if you're able to do that, like some of these companies that I mentioned earlier, you can be very successful. US Polo has been very successful in India. AirAsia and Vistara, they're absolutely killing the market. So it's really a question of coming in with a strong partner, and I think this is the bottom line. Coming in with a strong partner, that partner is committed to delivering on what they were supposed to be delivering on, and you as the Western entity being adaptable to local attitudes, and to local conditions and attitudes, and not being too stuck onto a particular way of functioning.
Okay. So a lot of
that was a very, very long answer.
A lot of interesting things that I'm going to jump into and start reading about all these different relationships. I'm sure it's probably like a soap opera. But if just to kind of finish off, I guess, if someone watching was thinking about wanting to get into India, didn't have any network there, didn't have any kind of links already established, what's like the couple things would you advise them to do, in order to kind of just start making links, start dipping their toe in? Is it about flying out there and just trying to get to know the place in a way? Is it looking at trade and investment programs, reaching out to other companies just to try and make links personally? Is it to try and source an in-country expert or like a partnership expert like you? Or like what's the first thing that they should probably do if they're thinking about this stuff?
So I would think it's all of the above. So trade and investment entities, yes, those are always initial, good points of contact. Flying out or coming to India is obviously a good idea. Look, I'm in Bangalore. If I wanted to get into business with somebody in the north, uh, or just, even anywhere else, even, 500 miles away from me, I would still go out and meet them and try to understand their business and try to understand what it is they bring to the table and talk to them in terms of what it is I bring to the table. Trying to do things over the, over the internet, or trying to establish some sort of a contact. I guess that's an initial way of establishing contact, but it is important. Face-to-face interaction, even in this day and age, I would say is crucial. There's a lot of body language. Sometimes not everybody understands Indian body language. That's another issue altogether. But it's important. I think face-to-face, you have to have a gut sense in terms of whether you could work with somebody when you're looking to get into partnership with them. And yeah, I mean, going through a specialized agency, whether it's it's one or two independent entities, or whether it is a firm that specializes in JVs, in cross-border JVs, I would think that's the way to go. But there's obviously, depending upon who you work with. I mean, if you work with a Deloitte, or you work with an E&Y, obviously they're gonna charge you they're going to charge you quite a packet. If you work with a smaller entity, then there's more there's much more of a customized approach, and there's much more of a hands-on sort of approach. So I think all those that you mentioned are important. I would stress the most important thing is you first have to, when all the analysis paralysis has happened, at the end of the day, it comes down to a gut feel. And I think, many business leaders across the world would say the same thing. I read Richard Branson's story, and he does a whole bunch of analysis for investment projects that he considers. But at the end of the day, he's got to feel good about it. So does Peter Lynch. So does Warren Buffett in terms of investment he wants to make. You just have to have an instinctual sort of gut feeling. And some of these things work out, and some of these things don't work out. But then at least you've given it your best shot. And I think it's a combination of all these three. Because you have to select and vet a good partner. You have to align your interests. Point number two, you have to look at how you're going to be doing decision-making, how you're going to be resolving conflict. You've got to look at exit strategies. You've also got to understand which India you're targeting. As I said in the beginning, I mean, if you just focus on India, India is not just India. India is a continent. So are you targeting, middle India? Are you targeting rural India? Are you targeting, just high-end luxury, luxury wanting India? I mean, you've got to understand who your market is. And you've got to understand something called, there's a unique Indian word called jugaad. That's spelled Jugaad, which basically means managing or adjusting, how to be creative to make things happen, because nothing happens in India, in exactly a straight direction, but you have to kind of know how to navigate. And I think it's important that you actually get a hold of somebody who can help you with jugaad. So I think these are all sort of important areas. Partnerships, one more point about partnerships failing. Partnerships fail, in my opinion, and I think many business analysts would also say the same thing in India. Partnerships fail because they don't define their reason for existence beyond simply being a vehicle for making money. So in India, you find that a lot, not just within cross-border sort of interaction, but also domestic partnerships. There's no focus on values. There's no focus on career paths. There's no focus on life goals. What are you trying to achieve? If you look at a company like Tata, Tata is very fundamentally focused on values, on providing careers, providing options to their employees. And, even if you're working for the Tatas, even if you're not necessarily being paid the greatest, you do have a certain work-life sort of balance. So people who work with the Tatas stay with the Tatas, and it's quite an incredible company. And I think I keep stressing on the Tatas because there's a lot to learn from the Tatas in terms of how they've been able to operate in India and be so successful for so long. And they're a conglomerate that's been in existence for the past 150 years and going strong. So anyone who wants to enter India should read up a little bit about the Tata story. JRD Tata, being the founder of industry, he was also the founder of airlines in India. I think it'd be a very interesting read for anyone who's watching this and listening to my comments to pick up a book on JRD Tata and really understand how Tata grew in India and how they, how they're doing everything right for the most part.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll add that to our resource list. We're assembling a huge list of resources to share with everyone. But thank you very much, Samir. Thanks so much for taking your time, and especially in dealing with the power issues. It's been incredibly interesting to kind of deep dive into this with you. I've been looking forward to it for a while. But thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Rob, and I do hope your viewers and people listening in enjoyed this as well, and hopefully there'll be a chance for further interaction with one or a few of them.
Yeah, cool. All righty. Take care.